Hello, thoughtful Libra. There is something about the way you read a room that deserves a second look, because you can sense a shift in the atmosphere before anyone has found the words to name it. You notice the hesitation in someone's voice, the silence that lasts a little too long, the tension sitting quietly between two people, and almost without thinking, you begin searching for the point where everything might settle again. But as you move through August 13, 2026, there is another question worth bringing into that awareness. When you are so quick to understand where everyone else is coming from, how often do you stop to ask where you are standing? For a long time, people may have described this as one of your greatest strengths. You are diplomatic, considerate, thoughtful, and able to see more than one side of almost any situation, and there is truth in that. But there is another layer beneath those qualities that deserves attention, especially when your ability to create harmony becomes so familiar that you no longer notice how much of yourself you are adjusting along the way. You may soften a sentence before speaking it, reconsider an opinion because you can already imagine someone's reaction, or choose the safer response simply because you know what might happen if you say exactly what you feel. That kind of awareness can look effortless from the outside, almost like something you were simply born knowing how to do. Yet inside, it can become tiring when there is no moment to switch it off. You are not necessarily trying to please everyone, and you may not even think of yourself as someone who sacrifices for others. Sometimes you are simply trying to make sense of every perspective at once. You can see why one person feels hurt, why another became defensive, why a certain conversation went wrong, and what each person might need to hear next, while your own feelings quietly wait somewhere outside the conversation. Over time, that instinct can become more than social intelligence. It can become a way of protecting your inner world from unnecessary turbulence, because disagreement may feel heavier when you have spent so much of your life learning how to soften it. A tense room can pull your attention immediately, and an unresolved conversation may continue turning over in your mind long after everyone else has moved on. So you do what comes naturally. You adjust your tone, find a gentler explanation, make room for another perspective, and sometimes give up a little of your own position simply because restoring ease feels more important in that moment. What makes this pattern difficult to recognize is that it does not always look unhealthy. Often it looks mature. It looks generous to understand before reacting, wise to consider another person's feelings, and kind to prevent an unnecessary argument from becoming something larger. But there is a quiet difference between choosing peace and abandoning your own truth to preserve it, and that difference can become almost invisible when self-editing has been part of your way of relating for a long time. This is where the image of the Libra scale begins to change. The problem may not be that one side of the scale receives too little, but that you keep moving your own weight whenever someone else shifts theirs. You recalibrate, accommodate, reconsider, and make another adjustment until the room feels steady again. Yet somewhere in that process, your own position becomes harder to recognize. The scale appears balanced because you have become so skilled at moving yourself that no one can see how much effort it takes to keep everything level. And perhaps this is why receiving can feel strangely unfamiliar. Giving understanding comes naturally because you know how to anticipate what another person might need, but receiving asks something different from you. It asks you to stay in your own position long enough for someone else to meet you there, without immediately deciding what they need from you in return. That can feel uncomfortable for a Libra who has become accustomed to believing that harmony depends on their ability to keep adjusting. There may be moments when someone asks what you actually want, and, surprisingly, the answer does not arrive right away. Not because you have no desires, but because you are so practiced at considering the entire room that your own preference can become just another voice among many. You might know exactly what would make someone else comfortable, what would avoid tension, or what would keep a relationship moving smoothly, while the simpler question, what would feel honest for me, takes longer to reach. And this is where the deeper question begins to emerge. When did keeping the peace become more important than telling the truth about what you needed? When did understanding everyone else's perspective become easier than allowing your own perspective to remain present, even when someone might disagree with it? You do not have to become less thoughtful, less compassionate, or less willing to meet people. Halfway, the shift is subtler than that. because real balance may begin when you stop assuming that your side of the scale has to move every time someone else does. Perhaps the next layer of growth for you is not learning how to create more harmony around yourself. You already understand that language. It may be learning how to remain present when harmony is imperfect, when another person is disappointed, when two perspectives cannot immediately be reconciled, and when you do not have to be the one who makes the room comfortable again. There is a quiet strength in allowing other people to carry their own reactions while you remain honest about what is true for you, because you are capable of seeing both sides, Libra. But that does not mean you have to live permanently in the space between them. You can understand someone without agreeing with them, care about their feelings without managing them, and leave room for another person without making yourself smaller to create it. The balance you're being invited to consider around this August 13, 2026 moment is therefore not about making every relationship perfectly even. It's about noticing whether you have been removing yourself from the equation simply because it was easier to keep everything else comfortable. And maybe that is the part of your nature worth seeing differently now. Your sensitivity to imbalance is not something you need to lose, and your ability to bring calm into difficult spaces does not need to disappear. But when you begin applying that same careful attention inward, you may notice how often your own needs have been waiting quietly for permission to become part of the conversation. And that recognition can begin changing the way you meet yourself, the way you relate to others, and the kind of balance you are willing to build from here. If something in this pattern has felt strangely familiar, Libra, don't rush past that feeling. Sometimes recognition arrives quietly, almost like hearing your own name spoken from another room, and you may not understand why it affects you until you stop long enough to listen. The question is not simply whether you give too much to other people, but whether you have slowly learned to measure your own sense of worth by how useful you can be to them. For some Libras, this pattern may have taken shape very early, before you had the language to understand what you were learning. Perhaps being easygoing brought praise, being understanding made things smoother, or being the person who did not create problems seemed to make everyone around you more comfortable. None of this has to point to some dramatic childhood story. Sometimes ordinary words repeated often enough can quietly teach a child that being pleasant, adaptable, and useful is one of the safest ways to belong. And when a belief forms that early, it rarely announces itself as a belief. It simply becomes part of the way you move through the world. You may grow up thinking, "This is just who I am," when underneath that identity there may be an old strategy that once helped you feel secure and has simply continued long after you needed it in the same way. That is why the pattern can be so difficult to question. It does not feel like something you learned. It feels like something that has always been there. You may notice it in the smallest moments. In a conversation with friends, you could be the first person to understand why everyone is upset, the first to find the words that soften the atmosphere, and somehow the last person to say what you actually felt. In a relationship, you may adjust your tone, your expectations, even your behavior with such subtle precision that the other person barely notices you are doing it, while inside you are constantly calculating what will keep the connection steady. Then there are the quieter moments, when the conversation is over and you finally have space to yourself. That is when you may realize how much energy went into making someone else feel understood, comfortable, reassured, or safe, while very little remained for you to ask what your own heart needed. It can look like generosity, and sometimes it genuinely is, but there can also be fear underneath it. The fear that if you stop being the one who understands, adjusts, and restores the balance, your place in someone else's life might become uncertain. And perhaps the most uncomfortable part is realizing that no one may have explicitly asked you to carry all of that. You may have decided somewhere along the way that this was simply the safest way to love and be loved. If someone needed patience, you had it. If someone needed understanding, you offered it. If a situation became tense, you knew how to soften it, and little by little, usefulness could begin to feel like proof that you belonged. This is where the distinction between being loved and being needed becomes important. They can feel remarkably similar when you have spent years receiving reassurance through what you do for other people, but they are not the same thing. being needed can give you a clear role, a purpose, and a sense of security while being loved. Asks you to believe that your presence still matters even when you are not fixing anything, solving anything, or making someone else's life easier. That difference can become especially visible when someone asks you a very simple question. What do you want? You might be surprised by how much harder that question feels than what would make everyone comfortable, or what would keep this from becoming a problem. They sound similar on the surface, but they come from completely different places, because one asks you to locate yourself, while the other asks you to manage the environment around you. And perhaps this is one of the deeper shifts available to you now. You do not have to stop being considerate, and you do not have to become careless with other people's feelings just to prove that you have boundaries. The real change is learning to notice when you're making a choice because it is genuinely right for you, and when you're making it because you already know how everyone else might react if you chose differently. For a Libra, that distinction can take time because you are naturally capable of holding several perspectives at once. You can understand why someone feels the way they do without realizing that understanding them does not require you to abandon your own position. You can allow another person to be disappointed without immediately treating their disappointment as a problem you have to solve, and you can let a little tension remain in the room without rushing to turn it into peace. There is something important in that pause. The moment you stop automatically reaching for the perfect words, stop adjusting every detail, and allow yourself to hear what you actually feel, you may discover that your inner world has been speaking all along. It simply had to become quieter than everyone else's needs for you to notice it. This is also why relationships can reveal the patterns so clearly. You may sometimes feel most certain of your role when someone needs reassurance, mediation, advice, or emotional steadiness, because there is something familiar about knowing exactly what you're supposed to do. But a healthier connection may ask something more vulnerable from you, not to rescue the moment, but to participate in it. Not to manage every emotion, but to express your own. The deeper question then is not whether you should keep creating harmony. It is whether harmony still belongs to you when you are allowed to be honest inside it. Because there is a difference between peace that comes from mutual understanding and peace that exists only because one person keeps editing themselves until nobody else has a reason to object. And this may be the part of your story worth looking at with greater tenderness. You may have spent years becoming exceptionally skilled at understanding what other people need, but that skill does not require you to remain invisible inside the relationships you help steady. The more honestly you can recognize your own needs without immediately negotiating them away, the more the idea of balance begins to change from something you maintain for everyone else into something you are finally allowed to experience from within. There is an old spiritual idea about carrying one another's burdens, but there is another part of that teaching that is just as important. Each person also has something of their own to carry. Libra can remember the first part almost instinctively, because understanding another person's weight often feels more natural than naming their own. You can sense when someone is overwhelmed, hurting, confused, or quietly asking for support, and you may step toward them before they ever have to explain what is wrong. But your own burden can become strangely easy to overlook. You may carry what belongs to someone else with such care that people admire your strength without realizing how rarely you stop to ask what your own shoulders have been holding. And this is not a lesson about becoming selfish or turning away from people you love. It is about becoming whole enough to recognize that compassion does not require you to disappear inside someone else's struggle. A gift that only moves outward with nothing allowed to return to its source eventually becomes exhaustion, wearing the clothing of generosity. There is usually a quiet point when this pattern becomes impossible to ignore. It may not arrive through a dramatic argument, a breakup, or some obvious collapse that forces everyone to pay attention. Sometimes it arrives much later when you are finally alone and there is no one left to reassure, immediate, understand, or calm. You have spent the day helping one person find their way through a conflict, listening carefully to another person's pain, adjusting your own response so a third person would not feel hurt. And then you walk through your own door carrying a tiredness that sleep alone cannot explain. It is the kind of weariness that comes from tending other people's inner worlds so carefully that you forgot to check on your own. You may know which parts of someone else's life need attention, where their boundaries have weakened, where they are giving too much, or where they are afraid to speak honestly. Yet your own emotional rooms can remain untouched for far too long. You keep arranging the furniture in everyone else's house while leaving your own rooms dim and unopened, telling yourself that you will get to them when everything around you is settled. But what if everything around you never becomes completely settled? What if there is always another person who needs understanding, another disagreement that could be softened, another emotional atmosphere you could make easier to breathe in? This is where a deeper question begins to emerge for Libra. Can you stop automatically managing every imbalance without feeling as though you have stopped being yourself? That question reaches further than the fear of conflict. You may not actually be afraid of disagreement itself. You may be afraid of what disagreement reveals when you stop trying to control its outcome. If you no longer smooth every edge, anticipate every reaction, or make yourself more acceptable to the people around you, who are you when there is nothing left to adjust? And if the role of the peacemaker becomes quieter, what parts of you might finally become loud enough to hear? This is where the meaning of caring for yourself needs to change. It is not a betrayal of your sensitivity, your kindness, or your ability to understand people from different sides. In fact, caring for yourself may be what allows those qualities to become more honest. Because there is a difference between offering peace freely and offering it because you are afraid of what might happen if you do not. The gift does not become smaller when you include yourself in it. It becomes less exhausting and more conscious. There is a particularly strange paradox here. The person who can often see both sides of an argument with remarkable clarity may still struggle to look directly at the side of themselves that hurts. You can mediate between two people who barely understand each other, recognize the insecurity beneath someone's anger, and explain with astonishing accuracy why a friend keeps accepting less than they deserve. But when the same insight turns toward you, something can become quieter, almost as though the mirror changes when you step in front of it. You may see yourself in fragments, a feeling here, a preference there, a moment of irritation that you quickly explain away before it becomes inconvenient. You notice yourself only long enough to understand what needs to be adjusted, and then your attention moves outward again. It is not necessarily hypocrisy, and it is not a lack of self-awareness. Sometimes it is protection, because truly recognizing your own pattern means admitting that some of the habits keeping you tired are also habits you have repeatedly chosen because they once made life feel safer, and this can influence the people you allow close to you. Without consciously intending to, you may feel drawn toward relationships where there is something to repair, clarify, mediate, or emotionally organize. A person in crisis gives you a role you understand immediately. A complicated relationship gives you something to solve. A tense environment gives your sensitivity a clear purpose. It does not mean you enjoy chaos, and it certainly does not mean you create it. But when someone needs nothing from you, a quieter and more unfamiliar question can rise beneath the peace. Who are you when nobody needs you to fix the atmosphere? That question can feel strangely uncomfortable because peace without a task attached to it may be unfamiliar. When a friend is struggling, you may know exactly what to say. You're exhausted because you have been giving more than you receive. You keep doing this because no one has asked what you need. You are allowed to have boundaries even when someone else is disappointed. You can offer those words with such natural precision that it seems obvious because you have spent years recognizing these patterns in the lives of other people. Yet when someone turns the same insight toward you, something may hesitate. The sentence that sounded so clear when you offered it to someone else suddenly becomes harder to accept when it describes your own life. It is as though the mirror can reflect the entire room perfectly, but the moment it reaches your own face, you instinctively look away. And perhaps that is the protection worth understanding rather than judging. Seeing your own pattern clearly would mean acknowledging not only what others have expected from you, but also how often you have participated in keeping the pattern alive because it gave you certainty, belonging, or a familiar sense of purpose. That realization does not have to become self-blame. It can become the first honest recognition that the role you learn to play is not the only way you are allowed to exist, and that there may be more of you waiting beyond the path that everyone has learned to rely on. It is often easier for you to help someone else put down a burden than to admit that you may be carrying one yourself, Libra, especially when you have become so practiced at hiding its weight. You can recognize exhaustion in another person, name the pattern behind their overgiving, and gently tell them that they do not have to keep carrying everything alone. But what if just once you interrupted that automatic movement towards someone else and turned the same attention toward yourself, asking, "What would I notice if I looked at my own life with the patience I give to everyone around me?" That question may feel uncomfortable because it changes the direction of your awareness. Instead of scanning the room for what needs to be repaired, you begin noticing what has been quietly asking for your attention within you. The mirror Libra sometimes avoids is not there to criticize you. It is there to show you what becomes difficult to see when your attention is constantly turned outward. And perhaps real change begins in that simple moment when you stop trying to become clearer about everyone else and allow yourself to become clearer about you. You've already spent years learning how to recognize subtle shifts in other people. You know when someone's words do not match what they are feeling, when a relationship has become uneven, when someone is giving more than they can sustain, or when a conversation is avoiding something important. The deeper practice is allowing that same perception to move inward without immediately trying to correct what you find. You do not need to judge every feeling, solve every insecurity, or turn every realization into another task. Sometimes awareness itself is the beginning of a different relationship with yourself. And perhaps this changes what your gift actually means. The gift was never simply your ability to make a room peaceful or to find the middle ground when two people cannot see each other clearly. That is the visible part, the part everyone notices first. There is something deeper in your ability to take what you have learned about tension, uncertainty, misunderstanding, and emotional imbalance, and turn those experiences into a kind of understanding that can make another person feel less alone. But that understanding becomes fuller when it is allowed to reach you too. Imagine a tree that has spent years giving shade, fruit, and shelter, so accustomed to offering something outward that no one stops to ask what is happening beneath the surface. From a distance, it may still look healthy, still reaching toward the light, still capable of giving more, while underneath the soil its roots are quietly asking for water. The tree does not complain about what it gives, but a person can eventually choose to notice when giving has become a habit of surviving rather than a choice made from abundance. This is where your choice matters, Libra. You cannot control every imbalance around you, and you were never meant to be responsible for restoring every relationship, every mood, or every uncomfortable silence. You can choose to pause before stepping in to let another person experience their own feelings without immediately managing them, and to ask whether your next act of kindness is coming from genuine care or from the fear that things will fall apart if you do not hold them together. The difference may seem small at first, but it changes the reason behind everything you do. When you begin allowing yourself to receive, your generosity no longer has to prove that you are worthy of being loved. When you admit that you are tired without apologizing for it, rest becomes something more natural than something you have to earn. When someone offers you care, and you allow yourself to accept it without immediately searching for a way to repay it, you begin discovering that connection does not always have to be an exchange that you carefully keep even. You may notice the change in difficult conversations too. Instead of rushing to fill every silence because you sense another person becoming uncomfortable, you may allow the silence to remain for a moment and give your own thoughts room to arrive. Instead of softening every truth until it becomes easier for someone else to hear, you may learn to speak with kindness without removing yourself from what you mean. Instead of asking, "How can I make this comfortable for everyone?" you may sometimes begin with, "What is honest for me here?" None of these choices looks dramatic from the outside. There may be no announcement, no visible turning point, no single moment when everything suddenly becomes different. But inside, each one creates a small opening in a pattern that may have been reinforced for years, perhaps so quietly that you once mistook it for your personality. Little by little, your side of the scale begins to carry something of its own, not because someone else has finally decided to fill it for you, but because you have stopped removing your own needs whenever another person brings theirs into the room. Some people might call this maturity. Others might call it healing, self-awareness, therapy, or simply learning healthier boundaries. The name matters less than the experience itself, because underneath all those words is something much more human, the permission to exist without constantly proving your value through what you provide. You do not have to balance the entire emotional world around you to justify your place within it, and you do not have to become indispensable before you can feel secure. Perhaps the deeper gift waiting within your Libra nature is not perfect harmony at all. Perhaps it is the ability to understand that peace can be shared without being surrendered, that compassion can move in both directions, and that caring for someone else does not require you to abandon the person you are becoming. You can still be the person who makes difficult spaces gentler, who sees the perspective others miss, who brings thoughtfulness into relationships while also allowing some of that gentleness to remain with you. There is a quiet beauty in that shift. You begin to understand that a safe relationship is not only one where another person feels comfortable around you, it is also one where you are allowed to remain fully present inside yourself. A peaceful environment is not simply one without conflict. It is one where different truths can exist without one person having to disappear to make room for the others. And as that understanding settles more deeply into you, the balance you create begins to feel less like a responsibility you carry for everyone, and more like a living quality that can move naturally between you and the people you care about. The scale does not have to become perfectly still. Life will continue to move, people will continue to change, and some conversations will remain unresolved longer than you would prefer. But perhaps you no longer need to treat every movement as something you must immediately correct. Because there is another kind of balance available to you now, the kind that allows you to remain rooted in your own truth while still leaving room for someone else's. And as you begin to trust that space, you may find yourself discovering more of the person who has always existed beneath the role of keeping everything in harmony, still listening, still learning, and still becoming.